For Chapter 3, I want to talk about two different topics in two different videos. The first of them is this one, which we talk about how to derive the demand curve. The second one we'll talk about the elasticity of demand. So for this discussion of how we derive the demand curve, we want to start by remembering the concept of the margin. When we talk about economic way of thinking in general, it's really about the marginal value of things. When we talk about marginal benefits and marginal cost, what we're talking about are the additional benefits or costs I receive or pay for a specific concrete choice or action that I take. All right? So for example, your decision to watch this video isn't really about the total cost of your Ball State education or the total value of taking an intro econ class. What you're really doing by spending the time to watch this video is saying, is it worth it for me right now to spend 10 or 15 minutes watching another Horowitz video versus whatever it is that I have to do? Is it worth it for me on this specific time and on this specific day to do that? And when we talk about choice on the margin and we talk about marginal benefits and marginal costs, that's what we're talking about. We act, we choose based on the additional benefits and costs we associate with the specific choice in front of us in that specific context. As the textbook points out to you, with one of my favorite examples from it, if you're have a physics test tomorrow and you're up studying and your friends text you and say, hey, let's go out and let's head out to the bar, and you say, I can't, I got to study for my physics test tomorrow, and your friends say, oh, so you love physics more than you love us. And the correct answer from an economist is, yes, I do, on the margin. I don't love physics more than you guys overall, but today, right now, studying for this test, yeah, I love physics, at least studying for physics anyway, more than I love you. Value is never all or nothing, always at the margin. So what does this have to do with the economic concept of demand? Well, the key is when we think about what it is that we want to buy, when we think about decisions about what we want to demand, right, we're always thinking in terms of these trade-offs, in terms of these marginal adjustments, these marginal valuations. The way I like to think about it's a little bit different than the book does, so I want to start with, imagine we have a guy stranded on an island somewhere, the classic sort of economics example, and again, it's unrealistic, but it helps us clarify a few important things. So let's imagine this guy's stranded on an island. Let's think also about the fact that water for him is very scarce, at least usable water. And let's suppose that he can only find buckets of water that's sort of lying around the island, and then as he finds them, he's able to think about how to use them. And the first thing we can start by doing is sort of giving him what I like to call a scale of preferences. And so here's the various ways in which he might use these buckets of water that he finds. The first bucket, the most important thing to him, and this scale of preferences is in order of importance, right? The most important thing for him is to have some water to drink. If he has some additional water, the next most important thing is he'd water some crops. If he has some additional water, he'd like to be able to wash his clothes. And then finally, if he had even more water, another bucket, he would feed some animals, perhaps that he's thinking about, animals he's raising that he might want to use for whatever purpose. So that's his scale of preferences. Most important to be able to drink, then water crops, wash his clothes, and then feed animals. So let's think for a minute. Again, ranked in that order. What happens if he does sort of stumble across these buckets of water? What we have here, that ranking, that scale of preferences, is a list of the ends of the goals to which water might be devoted. And we're going to suppose that each of those requires one bucket of water each, and that as he stumbles across these buckets, he's going to use them appropriately. So what will he do if he finds one bucket of water on his island somewhere? Obviously, he's going to do the thing that's most important to him. He's going to satisfy the most important end, which in this case is he's going to drink that. He's going to use it to drink. Okay. If he should walk around and then find a second bucket, what will he do? Well, he'll devote it to the next most important thing, right? He'll devote it to watering his crops, and if he finds a third, he'll wash his clothes with it, and then finally, he'll feed the animals if he should find a fourth. And we can sort of break down all of this that he's doing here into some terminology that's important to us. And again, if you have the PowerPoint handy, you might want to get it out here and look at slide number 3 from Chapter 3, where we talk about the difference between utility and marginal utility. The idea of utility in economics is what we think of as the general ability to satisfy an end. That is, water has utility because it quenches thirst, or at least, to be precise, people believe it quenches thirst. So if you recall from Chapter 2, we talked about the idea of subjective value, right? So the fact that you think this good can satisfy some end, right, it gives it utility. But marginal utility refers to the ability of a specific quantity of a good to satisfy a specific end. So when we talk about the marginal utility of water, in the case of our friend on the island here, we're talking about the particular bucket, the particular gallon in front of him, and the end to which he is going to devote that. And one of the interesting things about marginal utility is that the marginal utility of a good diminishes as we acquire more of it, because successive units of that good get applied to less highly valued ends. Now, what does that mean? Think in terms of our buckets of water. As our friend discovers more buckets of water lying around his island, he devotes them to ends that he believes are less valuable. That first bucket has the highest marginal utility to him, has the highest value, because it's being devoted to an end that has the highest value. The second bucket of water he finds is less valuable. Its marginal utility is a little bit less. Why? Because it'll be used for an end, watering the crops, that's less valuable to him than his most important end, which is drinking it. So one of the things to remember about goods, about the particular things that we acquire in the marketplace, right, is that their value isn't inherent, again, in the thing itself. Their value derives from the value of the end to which we put it. So that first bucket of water, its value derives from the fact that we satisfy an important end with it, drinking it, right? The second bucket of water has less value to us, its marginal utility is lower, because the thing we use it for is less. The want we satisfy is less urgent with it, that is, watering crops, is less urgent to us than is drinking it. Okay, and this is the key here, right? This idea of, and this is what we call the diminishing marginal utility of goods, right? As the first unit of the good we get is the most valuable because we're going to devote it to the end that we think is the most valuable one, right? And you can think about our guy on the island, right? How much effort is he going to put forward finding that first bucket of water? He'll put a lot of effort into finding it. Why? Because the value of that's very high to him. But if you think about how much effort would he put into the second one, well, maybe slightly less. He'd like to be able to water those crops, but it's not quite as important as drinking. And the third one, washing his clothes, well, he's by himself, so if his clothes are dirty and stinky, not that big a deal, but he'd like to be able to clean them. And obviously, he's not going to put a lot of effort walking around the island into finding a fourth bucket of water to feed the animals. Okay, so this is, when we sort of look at this idea again, it's the value of the physical good derives from the end to which we put it. So here's the question. Now let's suppose he had to purchase these buckets of water, right? What can we learn from that, right? Well, what would be the case? How would he what would he be willing to pay for the first bucket versus the second bucket? Obviously, he's going to be willing to pay more for the first bucket of water than the second. Why? Because it's devoted to a more valuable end, right? The fact that that drinking is more important than watering the crops means he'll be willing to pay more for that first bucket of water than the second one, right? So if someone offers him one bucket of water, whatever price he might pay for it, say $10, right? If now offered a second one, he's going to be willing to pay something less than $10 to get it. Okay, and if we sort of flip that around a little bit and now sort of say, well, okay, let's suppose the price of water was, say, $6 per bucket, right? $6 per gallon. How many would he buy? The question is, how many of the ends to which he would put buckets of water are worth giving up $6, right? So it might be worth it to give up $6 to have a bucket to drink. It might be worth it to him to give up $6 to have one to water crops, but it might not be worth it to give up $6 to have one to wash his clothes. It's going to depend on exactly where that price is and depend actually in the real world on what the alternative uses are of that $6. What else can he do with those $6? Is there something else he can do that's more valuable, say, than using it on a third bucket of water to wash his clothes? These are the kinds of decisions that we make all the time, right? We think about, is it worth it to spend $4 on a latte at Starbucks? Well, okay, maybe the first one we have in the morning, it's pretty valuable, the caffeine, we want the caffeine, it gets us going. But what else can we do with that $4 that might be more valuable, right? So the question is it worth it? And do we want a second one? How much would we be willing to pay for a second one? Probably not as much as the first one. So one of the things that we can see here is that as the price of a good goes down, people are likely to buy more units of the good. Why? Because at a lower price per unit, more of the ends that they might wish to satisfy will be worth satisfying, right? If the price of buckets of water is pretty low, it's worth it to our guy to buy 3 or 4 and satisfy even his least important ends. Again, if what he has to give up is very little. On the other hand, if the good is very expensive, if buckets of water cost a lot, right, he's only going to be willing to devote a certain amount of resources. That is, if buckets of water are very expensive, he's only willing to pay for, say, 1 to get the most important thing, to use it to drink. We can think about when gasoline prices change. When gasoline prices are high, we don't take frivolous trips in the car. We use that gasoline for the most important things that we think are necessary. Right, the higher the price, the more we have to think carefully about how we want to use that good. And what this does is give us what we call the law of demand. And the law of demand, again, if you have the PowerPoint, you can look at slide number 4. The law of demand simply says, if the price of a good increases, holding everything else constant, quantity demanded will decrease. That is, the higher the price, the fewer units of the good people will buy. Likewise, if the price of a good decreases, that if the price falls, everything else held constant, the quantity demanded will increase. At a lower price, people will buy more of the good. And what that gives us is the downward sloping demand curve. And again, if you have the PowerPoint with you, you can see that. I can also draw it for you here on the whiteboard. And you can see, right, that our demand curve slopes downward. That's P on the vertical axis for price, Q on the bottom for quantity, right, as in the textbook and as in the PowerPoint, right? At higher prices, the quantity demanded, that is the amount people are willing to purchase, is less. As the price falls, people are willing to purchase more. It's important to keep in mind that when we do this, when we talk about this, that phrase, holding everything else constant. If you look in the textbook, you'll see that there are a number of different factors that can shift the demand curve. Okay, and there's 6 of them listed in the textbook. And those are all the other things that we're holding constant. When we construct that demand curve, for example, we're holding constant the number of people who are interested in buying the product. We're holding constant people's tastes and preferences. We're not letting that list of uses of buckets of water shift around. We're holding people's incomes constant. That is, we're not allowing them to get richer or poorer. We're also holding constant the prices of substitute goods. So what else could you buy instead of water? We're holding that constant. We're also holding the prices of constant of what we call complementary goods, things you might want to buy with water. We're also holding constant no changes in the expected price of the good. All we're doing when we construct that demand curve is saying everything else constant. If all that we change is the price of this good, say buckets of water, how much more or less will you buy? All those other things, we're locking them away in a box, right, and saying those aren't changing. What we see, and you'll see when you take a look at the textbook, is that when we allow those other things to change, when we allow all of those other factors to not be held constant anymore, what we get are movements in the demand curve. We get shifts in the demand curve to the right or to the left, depending upon whether they increase or decrease demand. And we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next video, where we'll also talk about elasticity.